So greetings. This is class 8 of belonging to each other and the planet. And today we're going to talk about economics. But first, a few little business things. One, I've got at least, so Kathy and Kate and Sean have all um, sent very sweet messages saying hello to everybody and their appreciation of everybody. But two of them won't be able to make the rest of the classes, and someone's coming back. And the next class is the last class, and it's going to be about science and spirituality, which is another, false dichotomy or another polarity that gets handled in a competitive rather than in a way of promoting understanding within the narcissistic paradigm, and gets used in that way to divide people rather than for people to understand how those work together. Um, I think I'll probably just offer for whoever wants one extra class, which would just be, where do we go from here, or just what anything people want to share. That class would have no presentation. It would just be what might be useful to me in terms of what's been useful or what hasn't, or what are people taking with them from this. But mostly just a place for people to say what they have in mind about where they're moving to, and might also get some feedback in the sense that, a lot of people's gifts have been revealed here. And I'm certainly interested in giving people feedback about some of the things that I have noticed as people's gifts that I think would be great to keep offering to the world. Um, I want to put out a class list um, so that people can contact each other. I sort of said I was going to do that before, and then there was a difficulty with it. Ali, so first of all, I'm going to send out one more email offering everybody on the email list the opportunity to tell me they don't want to be on a list that we're going to share with the class, with the rest of the class. Um, and also another thing is Ali doesn't want us, without getting permission, to use class lists for our own purposes, but I am interested in building a list of people who might possibly be interested in some other stuff I have to offer, whether I do a future workshop or whatever else. So I'm going to offer an opportunity to get off that list if you want, but otherwise I will want to have a list of people who I might want to recontact in some form or other. So, actually, just a little review here. Class 1 and 2 were sort of presenting the basic paradigm, the idea of one great mistake, and the life cycle of paradigms, and how a paradigm, first of all, reaches every realm of people's lives within that paradigm, and how a paradigm gives birth to its successor, coming out of the blind spots and faults and costs, the cost of the blind spots of any particular paradigm. Um, the third class was basically just getting to know each other class. Fourth was the psychopathology of narcissism and versus healthy development. Fifth class was evolution, and we talked about the survival of that which fits in, as opposed to the survival of that which, of the quotes fittest. The fittest is used in a simplistic way to mean the baddest or toughest. And we talked about that our evolutionary history has given us adaptive and important pro-social instincts and instincts for belonging that offer us an instinctual internal uh, guidance for how to find belonging. The sixth class was on the human brain and how to have the various parts of the human brain operate sort of in teamship and cooperation and communion with each other, as opposed to having, which is to say, to have an executive function that is a servant leader, if you want to call it that, the PFC. rather than having a logical function that is sort of trying to overrule and be the king of the rest of the emotions and of the body, and detached from those, and of which we used like Eichmann as an example of what happens when the rational function goes berserk and unaccountable. And then we talked about fascism, and basically fascism being narcissism on the national level, and what its what its appeal is and what its antidotes might be. So you see that those are part of the concentric circles that we say make up the different realms, and we're saying because they're part of one paradigm, the same issues, narcissism, which we've been shortcutting using narcissism versus communion, the same issues come up in each of those realms. So, hey, Carol, how you do? And so today I want to talk about economics. I have an MA in graduate work at Berkeley in economics, environmental economics. It was about 15 minutes from a PhD when a midlife crisis hit that led to my deciding to become a psychotherapist instead of an economist. And that's a long story, but those are my credentials for being an economist. And I was trying to be a progressive economist, but there was a movement. No, there was a powerful movement of young progressive economists. Most of it's considered themselves Marxists of some stripe or other. That was pretty important in this is the late 70s, early 80s. But it was really fighting, in some ways, so there are enclaves where that's happening. But definitely mainstream economics which is very much an excuse for mainstream economics is extremely supportive of capitalism as it stands. So here's why and also I think economics is really the founding ideology of our society and our culture. It's the founding ideology of corporate capitalist culture, and it's used to intimidate us because most people don't consider themselves economists or knowledgeable in economics, and so it's very easy to say if you just understood economics, you wouldn't have these strange ideas. And so partly I want to arm you guys with a well-structured critique of mainstream capitalist economics. I'm going to take a minute to pin myself. There I am. Okay. So economics is the founding ideology of corporate capitalism, and it plays the same role in the defense of corporate capitalism that the divine right of kings did for feudal society. Any system, and the ideology of any system has to make some kind of a plausible claim, or as plausible as possible, a claim for being in the general interest, for being in the interest of everyone, for being in the national general interest. And so the way that the corporate capitalist economic system does that, and the way its ideology serves that function, is with the invisible hand of competition, the invisible hand of the competitive market. So the basic argument is that the capitalist competitive economic market works in the interest of the whole, in the interest of all of us. That's the basic argument. And it comes from the unlikely proposition that if everyone operates in their own narrowest self-interest, you will get a good social result. Now that is, first of all, intuitively unlikely. is probably contradictory to most of our personal experiences. That if everybody acts like a jerk, that's going to be good for everybody. And it's certainly counter to any respectable spiritual tradition that's ever existed that I know of. But that's the argument. And you know, I studied economics as undergraduate, graduate, and then on the PhD level. Um, and on all of those levels, they make the same argument, but it's made at different levels of mathematical sophistication. So by the time you're doing it in graduate school, you have incredible mathematical models, all of which prove that if everybody tries to screw everybody else and just take care of themselves, it's going to be good for the whole. Um, and the mechanism for that is the invisible hand of the competition. Give me a second to check my notes here.
You say that last thing again about everybody screwing each other?
So this is an atomistic model, and I'll spell it out a little more. But the idea is if everybody just does what they want, if corporations do whatever is most profitable, and if everybody else does whatever is in their best interest, buys what's best, spends their money in the way that's selfishly best, then the profits will be made by those corporations which most serve the needs of the people as expressed in what they buy, and those will make the most profit, and those will grow and grow the economy and thrive. So the idea is that the market mechanisms make large corporate capitalist corporations invest their money in a way that's best for the whole, because they're actually just meeting the needs and the economic demand of the populace. Now, there's something to that, but there's a lot of reasons why that's not fully true. And that's what I'm going to kind of focus on. Did that clarify what you wanted, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
Well, that's basically the argument, is that if the corporations, in order to make profit, you want to meet the demands of the market. Meeting the demands of the market, that's essentially a democratic process, and you are serving this democratic process, and you are creating a world that a good world for everybody. And the better you do it, and the more you outcompete those who aren't as good at doing it, and that's measured by how much profit you're making, the better it is for everybody. Now, there is something positive to that ideology, and because it did free individuals from act. It said everybody can act in their own economic best interest, and that actually what human beings are is self-interest calculating machines, essentially.
That's like Ayn Rand.
Say what?
Sounds like Ayn Rand.
Yeah. Hey, Karen. Where was I here? Okay, so if my only interest is maximizing my profit, guess what? I'll be doing the right thing, because that will be answering the needs of the people who are choosing to buy my products, and so forth. And if I can pay my labor force less, so I can sell the products cheaper, so I can sell more of them, so I can make more profit, that's good for everybody, because we're all in it for ourselves. Now, you'll notice that our old friend, again, this is all a proof of the fact that if everybody acts purely in their own self-interest, you're going to get a good social result. Unrestrained self-interest will lead to a good result. And you'll notice our old friend atomism here, which is a fundamental piece of the conceptual apparatus of the narcissistic system. Atomism essentially says that the whole is only the whole is the sum of its parts, that the whole can be understood by looking at the actions of the individual parts. The whole is just a result, an accumulation of the individual actions of all the parts. And in this case, if all the parts act self-interestedly, the whole will meet everyone's self-interest. Now, okay, so in some ways, this loosed an enormous creative economic power and growth. So people were freed from feudal bonds, and if anything you could do, go for it. And so that loosed an amazing creative energy of capitalism that has changed the world and makes the world, makes the world that would be unrecognizable by our parents and maybe unrecognizable by me 30 years ago and so forth. Now, the downside of that is that it implies that the whole has no needs or requirements of its own. The whole has no needs or requirements of its own beyond the sum of the individual interests, so that there is no public interest, no concept of a public interest that's anything but the accumulation of the selfish interests of the parts in that model. Now you could see what if you ran a family that way, or a community or a club, with that idea that if everybody just does what's in their self-interest, everything will be cool, and you don't need any accountability of individuals to the general interest. So I want to get now to a more technical criticism of that argument. And partly, like I said, I'd like you guys to be armed to respond to that argument. The biggest critique is something called externalities. Externalities. And that was a way, that concept creeped into economic analysis because it was so clear that something was left out. But that term originally was like it was an exception. Oh yeah, there's this exception. Yes, externalities. And then we have to see what we can do about those externalities. But what I'm going to say is externalities are huge. And it's not a little exception. But anyway, an externality is a technical term now. An externality is anything that does not figure into the bottom line of a corporation. External costs are not considered by me if I'm making corporate decisions, and that includes the effects on the environment, because that's not a cost I have to pay unless society makes me pay it. But if there's no regulation and no mechanism for making for me taking on the costs of pollution, or the costs of unsafe products, or any of those costs that I can dump onto the environment or into society as a whole, poverty, anything, all of those social effects, none of those are motivated. I'm not forced to consider any of those if I'm simply working on the market. The market doesn't impose that on me. So what corporations do, in fact, is try to externalize those costs. They try to have the effect on communities, the effect of pollution, the effect on unsafe products, the effect, something like asbestos or cigarettes, all the work that they did to say, to lie, to consciously lie and say, no, there's no problem there. The effects of that, the fall of, say, lung cancer, fall onto society as a whole. But unless they're forced to deal with it in some way, it's not considered by the market. Does not force, the invisible hand of the market does not enforce a consideration of that. So it would take social rules to enforce good citizenship, but they're not. They don't get create. They're not automatic results of the workings of the competitive market. Marx said that this was a system. We needed to understand it wasn't that capitalists were bad or nasty or greedy, because if you decided as a capitalist, I'm not going to be like all these other capitalists. I'm going to be a nice capitalist, and I'm going to pay my workers twice as much as these people do and give them more safety regulations and blah, blah, blah. Guess what? You won't be a capitalist very long. So it's important to understand that this is not necessarily that the people making those decisions are bad people. What's important is that it's a system. It's a systematic thing that forces whoever's in that role, unless there's some external process from the outside of the market system, forces them to maximize their profits at whatever costs. But again, I said externalities were originally put in as like a kind of little exception in the economic theory. Oh, well, I guess there's some things that aren't taken care of by the market. But if you're starting looking at it, these are not marginal or peripheral. And in fact, if you look at the big picture, externalities include most of the conditions of our lives. The effect on nature, the effect on work, the effects on community life, extinctions, global warming. And there's no intrinsic mechanism within the capitalist market system for the public good to be enforced. There's no internal social restraints on the capitalist market system. So that's one, externalities. The other things, and these are sort of, I would say these are externalities too, if you want to say that these are effects that the market does not take care of. These are effects that that elude the supposed ability of the market to create a good social result from selfish behavior. So, number two, capitalism expands what it's about is a system that expands into the world. So what it does is commodify more and more things. It makes more and more things that you have to buy and that have to be sold and that private people can make profit on. The most original thing was just, Native Americans didn't own land. And it was sacrilege to them that someone could own land. But so there's this privatization, which involves a shrinking of the public space and public resources from the expansion and privatization. So land, ideas get more and more privatized. Seeds, DNA, the whole thing of Monsanto, where they've privatized the DNA of certain seeds. Parks, beaches, rainforests, all of those get privatized, and the public space gets cut into. Like we have some laws like you can't just build on the beach. The beach belongs to everyone. Well, you go to Puerto Rico, and if you're not a rich foreigner, you probably don't hardly get to set foot on the beach unless you're bringing someone drinks or, working in some way. Okay, 3, inequality. So what the argument for the democracy of capitalism is that it serves demand. It serves the demand of what people want. But guess what? Demand is not one person, one vote. It's $1, one vote. So if millionaires want their third yacht or want to buy an island, there's a demand for that. And if a poor person wants medicine for their kids and they can't afford it, there's no demand for it. So it's simply built in. Demand is $1, one vote. And it only meets those needs of those people who can afford to have economic demand. I once in one of my a big lecture at Berkeley, this guy was giving this talk, room full of people. This was I think the basic economics course for undergraduates, and he explained why the system was good. And so I said, isn't it a problem that it's $1 one vote, not one person one vote? So people who don't have money don't have demand, and their needs don't get met. People who have a lot of money have a lot of demand, and their needs do get met. Isn't that a problem? And he was basically a mathematician, yeah. And he said, you know what? If you don't like the distribution of labor, that's a whole other issue. Go fix that. That's not my fault. I can't tell you about that. You know, this system works, and if there's a problem with the distribution of labor, that's essentially external to my concern and my mathematical model. Go, if you don't like the distribution of labor, go do something about it. I'm neutral on that. I'm just telling you how my model works best. So basically, throwing up hands on the issue of inequality. One of the problems with that is that inequality is not an incidental product of a capitalist system. It's actually systemic. It actually gets created by how a capitalist system works. So it's not just this other thing, the distribution, that has nothing to do with the workings of the market. And one of the ways that happens is monopoly. Now, the other thing is, this is number 4. The other thing is the whole model, mathematical models and all those things they use are based on the idea of a competitive economy, and it's actually mathematically out the window once you have monopoly. So monopoly is the concentration of economic power, and when you have that, it's no longer a competitive model. And so it's like if you have big fish eating little fish, sooner or later you'll just have big fish. It's built in. So the argument for the benefits, for the general benefits of a market system, break down with monopoly, which is increasingly the basic structure of our economy. 5, this is another huge externality. The concentration of economic power leads to a concentration of political power. It's very difficult for a democratic political system to sit on top of an undemocratic economic system. And the economic system doesn't pretend to be democratic. For instance, your bosses, if you've worked in any kind of a corporation or system, will have been very clear to say to you, this is not a democracy. You don't make the decisions. We'll listen to you. We'll consider you if it's a liberal place, but this is not a democracy. So it doesn't even pretend to be democratic, and that system the effects of the economic system in bending the political system to the needs of economic power are an enormous factor in all of our lives. And this is not a plot necessarily. It is, among other things. They strategize and have board meetings, and that, no doubt. But even if they didn't, there's a thing called a capital strike, which means that if there's not a good economic environment right now, they just don't have to invest. And capital strike is one word for that. So guess what? They don't invest, and then you have a depression. And you have a depression because you didn't create a good business climate for these people to want to invest. Now, it's obvious if they're hoping to make 12% profit or 20% profit, and you're creating a situation where right now they can only get 8% profit, why shouldn't they just wait till the next administration comes in, or the political climate is better, and they'll invest then? And what's more, they'll have the advantage that the guy who's in there, or the party that's in there, that's making decisions that are something of a impingement on corporate economic power, then make a bet that, guess what, it will help. If we don't invest, then the economy will tank, and his chances of getting reelected aren't very good. Now, that is only true. See, if those changes could be made in a convincing way, that is to say, if they knew that they could only make 6% profit instead of 12% from the foreseeable future, because that's a general agreement by both political parties, or by the political forces, they would happily invest for 4% or 6% or 2%, but not insofar as they have power to create a situation where there's a better economic climate from their point of view. Number 6, see, we start calling these externalities. It's really most of what describes how the world works. But again, technically, externality means something that the market does not, that profit maximization will not, the market will not enforce through profit maximization. Profit maximization behavior through the market will not enforce good results on any of these levels we're talking about. 6, so worldwide expansion of imperialism, which means so the capitalism, these corporations now have a worldwide reach, and that means that they go to those countries where they have the best business climate. It means that in those countries they try and create the best business climate they can. It means that they recruit American military to support governments that will create a good business climate, and to overthrow governments that won't. And so you have the whole imperial system, including the incredible amounts of money that goes into military spending and wars. So you can see, you start calling those things externalities. Wow. So capitalism has produced an enormous economic engine. The issue becomes, how does that engine get put in service of humanity and the environment? And basically what you would need is social restraints. So where do those come from? I want to say, by the way, that overthrowing capitalism is not by itself the solution. So if you, instead of having corporate capitalism, you, in the name of communism, create national capitalism, state capitalism. And if that state capitalism only also works just to increase the interest of the state, and has not an interest in the working people of that country, it'll be just as bad. So it's not just that if you socialize it instead of privatizing the production process, you're making something better, unless you have the social institutions, unless it's to a democratic social process, unless it's to a process that offers the social institutions that would rein it in. If like in Russia right now, the social institutions are all geared towards enriching national, certain interests and so forth, then the fact that it's no longer capitalist is not necessarily an improvement. But you need social restraints, and so the question is, where do those come from? And historically, the implement for those has been the nation state. And the nation state is I would say, a contested terrain. It's not an even terrain, because economic power has an enormous advantage in that contest. But I think it's still the only terrain we have. And the deal is, can we create democratic movements that are powerful enough to use the state in the interests of people as a whole? So now I'm going to talk about the macro historical evolution of capitalism and where we are right now. So the argument for a capitalist system is essentially the trickle down argument. That if the top people are doing best, that will trickle down to everyone else and be in everyone's interest. But the fact is that any system can only leave the bottom out for so long. You cannot leave the bottom out for so long. At some point, the heads are gonna roll, heads are gonna be chopped off. There's gonna be a response. When the argument that the existing system meets the needs of the whole gets less and less hard to make convincing. And so one example is, if you're not paying the workers anything, there's no demand, and who's going to buy your stuff? So there've been historical corrections to unrestrained capitalist development, and the two examples of those are in the era of the robber barons. There was finally there was Teddy Roosevelt's antitrust movement, and that was an example to bust trusts. This was in the 1890s, and to try to limit corporate monopoly power. And the other big one, of course, was with the Great Depression, where the problem with the Great Depression was that inequality got so bad that working people couldn't provide a market. And so there was no market for corporations to sell to. And so you had the Depression. This is when we were still a national economy, so you couldn't just sell it to some prince in Arabia. So the answer to that was the New Deal and mobilization of the government to provide money and funds and jobs that were not being provided by, and take care of needs that were not being provided by the private sector. But you can't run a system that leaves out the bottom forever. So where we are right now is that the expansion of multinational corporations there's a structural change, which is the expansion of multinational corporations beyond the reach of the nation state to hold them accountable. They're more powerful ultimately than the nation state at this point. And so they can search for a political climate, for cheap labor, for high infrastructure support, for low taxes, for low regulation, for a strong military to protect against an uprising, for a political system that they can shop the world for that best system and move there and put the whole world in competition for providing the attracting capital by providing the best possible business climate. Yeah, so it puts the whole world in competition for corporate investment and for providing the kind of business climate that will attract them. And what that's meant. So for the third world, that means that supporting governments that who take primarily responsibility for creating a good business climate which includes low wages, low safety regulations, everything else, and that their government, rather than standing up for their national needs. I mean, there are movements to do that, but the effort of multinational corporations is to entrench governments that do not meet the needs that aren't focused on meeting the needs of their nation and their people. In the developed nations, it's led to essentially a rescinding of the post-war social contract with labor and society. Post-war, we were flush. We were the only major economy in the world. The other economies were mostly destroyed by the war because we were the only major country that didn't have war within our nation's boundaries of the major nations.
World War II.
World War II, yes, right. So in the light of that contract, there was a social contract created, which was basically that we're going to have growth. The growth is going to be so much that it'll include everybody. It'll lift all boats, and in doing so, it will overcome the need for class conflict because we're all going up together, and the growth itself will smooth over and take care of the issues of the division, the share and the division of economic resources, because there'll be so much that we'll all be good. And now that didn't include everyone. It actually just included a largely white portion of the working class, which is some of the people who are losing their status right now. But nevertheless, anyway, so that post-war social conflict, social contract has been in the process of being rescinded. And it started with Ronald Reagan as the figurehead for that process. And the basic name for it was called austerity. But that's also what the Merkel in France did, in Germany did, and what the French government did, and all over the world. The developed countries said, my God, we have to do austerity because our working class is fat, rich, and happy. And we can't compete with third world labor as long as our working class maintains the privileges that they have fought for and gained, the unionization, the social contract, the social regulations, and so forth. So basically, and you may remember that the very first thing to make the point real clear Reagan did was attack there was a strike of the air traffic controllers, who were certainly
Yeah.
a privileged part of the working class, and thought, my God, you need us. You want all the planes to crash? And he said, guess what? You think you're privileged? You're done. We'll fire you. And the whole, the union movement in general will get the message. So it was sort of the original war cry against fat and happy unionism. Then they attack on unions, and then that private unions, and then that ended up being an attack on the state workers. And trying to say that these were privileged people, and trying to have the public in general think of themselves as being in opposition to these privileged workers. So what that meant was that the nation state has not, and because of the multinational nature of capitalism, has not been able to stand up for its citizens. The nation state has not been able to stand up to the New World Order in favor of the needs of its citizens. That includes wages, safety regulations, environmental regulations, public spending, health care, working benefits, and so forth. So the result of that is an enormous dislocation and an enormous anger in much of the American working class. Including, the effects on communities that where they've been company towns, and then the company says, goodbye. And, thank you that you built all these roads and these schools and all these institutions that gave us an educated working class. That was really nice. But guess what? We've automated the work process to the point where we don't need much of a skilled working class, and we'll go someplace else. So that anger could fuel a rebellion against unregulated corporate power, a movement for increasing economic inequality and so forth. And I think that's what's finally, there's been with Bernie and so forth, there's been a left wing of the Democratic Party, the non-corporate part of the Democratic Party, that's started directly to talk about oligopoly and inequality. But there's also the right-wing movement, which responds to people's upset and powerlessness and rage and anger and sense of their life being turned on its head by scapegoating outsiders. So then the fault is immigrants, black people, brown people, gay people, outsiders, and also liberal elites. So liberals, which is basically mostly middle class folks who are hardly the in the center of economic privilege, latte drinking liberals. Those are elites. So breaking out the different parts of what should be a unified movement of the 99%, separating those out and scapegoating, and basically to take the heat off of those who really control and reap the benefits of economic injustice. And one of the first things where you can really, that gives it away, any time that you are blaming, that you're shifting, that you're putting the blame for how things are on the people that have the least power and the least benefit from how things are. Something's funny, right? The reason things are so bad is because must be the result of the actions of people who have the least power in making things the way they are and benefit the least from the way things are. So the question is it what there is a need for an alliance of the 99%. And I'm really glad that concept got made public. That was a tremendous move, because it's a way of saying that when we talk about privilege, we're not talking about the fact that somebody makes, $40,000 more than someone else, and we're not talking about the fact that someone drives a nicer car. We're talking about the fact that some people are making, thousands more than the people who work for them. So if the state is a contested terrain, the Green New Deal would be one effort to have the political system really make a difference, not operate on the fringes. One of the things that liberal Democrats did was they started talking about cultural issues and cultural injustice because they didn't want to address the major economic power and economic interests. And that's part of what led to all this division. That, okay, we're going to make sure that, black people get into college. Well, you could have had a law that said, how about first generation people get preference in college, and not create a division not have working class white people say, well, I'm so privileged that black people should get privilege over me. There would have been ways to do that didn't divide people up. But the fact that corporate liberal Democrats wouldn't take on the prerogatives of capitalist power meant that they did their progressive stuff sort of around the corners. Okay, we'll be nicer to gay people. We'll be nice, not that those aren't important issues, but they're important issues because they're part of a whole unifying movement of everybody. And that includes the economic interests of everybody. And that's not only going to happen with a redistribution of the economic and political power. So the only thing that'll work is some kind of a unity of, say, states and nations. So, for instance, so there's an interesting, just in the paper yesterday, Yellen and Biden got most of the capitalist major countries to agree to a minimum tax rate that would be for every nation. It's a huge potential achievement, because that's the thing, right? Instead of them competing for who does the least taxes, saying, guess what? Wherever you move, this is going to be your tax. So really coming together to remove the incentive rather than compete. Right now, guess what? All these nations agreed to it, but the Senate won't pass it. Looks like. But that's an example. That's an example. Someone want to add something?
So much to add. Passage.
Mm-hmm. And so that's true for states too, right? The move to the South, of industry to the South was all about the South competing We're a non-union state. The states competing with each other for attracting capital, rather than having national laws that say, guess what, you can move this to a certain state if you want, but it's not going to create a cheap non-unionized force. So this has been talking about narcissism and that model of how life works or should work within the narcissistic system. So again, the basic theme is one of cooperation in terms of the interest of the whole, which is what's needed. I think it has a chance, by the way, because the force, something's going to have to give. But that, so that would be the paradigm of communion in the political and economic realm. And that versus the paradigm of narcissism, which is about dominance, whether it's economic power, imperialism, class power, race, privileges, whatever you want to call it. The paradigm of narcissism exploits divisions in favor of maintaining dominance of the privileged few. And one incredible example, right? Global warming, right? So can we get together to fight global warming? Can we agree, all of us? What could be something more obviously in everybody's interest? Well, no, we can't do that right now because we're fighting a war, and that takes precedence, right? So, so
So would you, Bob, would you say that statement again? Exploit division to maximize something. What was it?
to maximize entrenched power and privilege,
Thanks.
to keep those who are out of power and out of privilege from combining and getting together and saying, wait a minute. So can the failures of, for example, the economic system and the anger, so we talked about there's a paradigm. The paradigm has blind spots and harms, becomes unsustainable. And at that point, something new gets born out of it. And it gets born out of the blind spots and the broken promises of the existing system. So what would that be on the economic level?
Different way of thinking.
Yeah.
There are such models out there.
So can that anger be coordinated to unify the 90% and make fundamental change? And I think we're ripe for that because the failures of the old system are becoming unsustainable. And the seedbed and the womb of change and rebirth are being created as we speak. And that's my little talk. And I'm looking forward to hearing comments and additions and questions.
I have a lot to say about this.
Yeah, well, go for it. I have a lot I'm love to hear about it.
I did my dissertation. I was an organizational consultant. That's one of the things I did, and I passed. And the model that was used was, I think, first put forward by Russell Acoff, who was a professor at the Wharton School. And his big thing that was widely talked about was a contrast between the machine age and the systems age. And in the systems paradigm, well, machine age is the one that you talk about, where you break everything down into the parts and you maximize parts, and the whole doesn't really have a reality other than it's just the sum of parts. And the systems age comes at things very, very differently because it has a different model of how things exist in the world, which is that you take in just a second. I'm gonna get this call quieted. You take in what you need from the environment. So that's never an externality. Just you take in things from the environment that you need. If you think of making an omelet, you need to get the eggs and the recipe and all of that. You need those externalities. They're not external. That's the point. You exist as a living system in an environment. You cannot separate those out. And one of the differences that fast forward to one of his extrapolations was the idea of a corporation as having multiple stakeholders that need all of them to be accounted for. And in the group that of consultants that I was in, they always said, look, the stakeholder that you ignore will come up over the hill and kill you. So you better pay attention to who your stakeholders are. And Milton Friedman, of course, said the only ones that are stakeholders that you need to account for are shareholders. Well, that's even debatable whether they're that powerful, but at any rate, and the only thing that a company exists for is profit.
Mm-hmm.
And he really created the dominant model that corporations went for. But there was this other one, and now it's coming back. And one of the people who is talking about this is the CEO of Salesforce, and he labeled it stakeholder capitalism, which means that you have to look at every stakeholder and how they impact your business, so that the model of, hey, ignore your workers so that they don't have enough to even buy the products you're producing, that kind of thinking would not happen, because you would have accounted for that in the way you strategized how to move forward and gain a competitive advantage that had to do with having a better product that better suited the needs of some outer whole that you are in fact connected to, interdependent with. So, there was a whole line of thinking, and that was also true in organizational work. And part of the organizational work that I was connected to talked about a transformation that needed to happen, not just the organization, but the people within it. So you had a dual transformation of capability in the organization and capability of the workers within it. And key to that started really in England, in coal mining, when they had the usual assembly line type of thing. But then they created these autonomous work groups, and the autonomous work groups outperformed the other by quite a lot. And so they started working a lot with, okay, how do you improve the capability of your workforce? That led to things like self-managing work teams, and teams where they actually set, not the managers, but the workers themselves were trained and got better pay as their capabilities increased. The only thing about that is it did threaten the managers, because all of a sudden the self-managing work groups were doing a lot of the things that managers thought they should be doing. Anyhow, there's a huge literature on this. Unfortunately, it did not survive the frontal attraction of Milton Friedman and the idea that profit ruled all. And that was the only thing that businesses were there to accomplish. And that is very, very much not the model that the systems people were talking about. So anyway, there's a whole lot out there, but I don't know right now whether or not much of that survives. It thrived, I would say, in the 70s, started in the 70s and got pretty popular and got some incredible results in the 80s. They were legendary results of productivity that outshone many other parts of the organization that they were in. But it required a lot of training, a lot of time for people to come together, to collaborate, and so on. My dissertation was in a company. I hope I'm not going on too long, but a company that actually had a division that used this process. And I was really curious to know whether or not there was a dual transformation. Did, in fact, they get more productivity? And did, in fact, people talk about that they thought about things differently? So that was my dissertation, and I won't go in, but I mean, it showed positive results in both those spheres. And I know these, and all this was within the capitalist model, but using a systems approach where you didn't see the external environment as externalities. Sure, there was a boundary, but they weren't seen as other. They were seen as intrinsically necessary.
Let me ask you a question. So this is fantastic work, and thank you for doing it. This is important stuff. And what I mean, what I see in this is an attempt to apply whatever you want to call it, good, progressive, holistic values in working within the corporate system, and finding that even within it, there were enormous advantages for it. Even that you could even advertise as in its own terms. You know that you'll be more productive if you treat people decently and access the power of people working together and community and so forth. So
autonomy.
But so the question for me is, and then and it still exists, but it didn't take over. And so I'm wondering
No.
what would be the outside of that. If that's within the corporate system, what would have been the political support, the social support that movement would have needed to have, that those changes would have needed to have to survive. That is to say, the support from outside of the corporate system. What are your ideas about what would be required to have those things more effectively and widely adopted within? I think they are adopted now within sort of elite sections of the corporate system, but
I'm not so sure it's how it survived, and I don't think, and it's so polarized now
yeah.
that I'm not sure that some of those self-managing work groups would be as effective, but it's really speculation. And sort
Well,
of,
so the thought I had was,
I wish it
if it
had
shows
survived.
itself to be advantageous even within a system that's geared towards needing to make at least enough profit, um, wouldn't it need to be regulated or enforced from some larger political or social movement that also put limits on it, that sort of that it imposed certain worker rights or imposed certain yeah, well, just for instance that, or impose certain worker power or whatever. So, even, to make sure that it was it enforced it being more profitable to treat people decently, even beyond where it was anyway. Is that clear?
Well, how did Mondragon happen?
Say what?
But
Mondragon in Spain, the cooperative movement, where
yeah,
how did that happen? Did that start from the bottom up? And I think it's still going.
I'm not sure. And I know that one of the strongholds of this way of thinking are in the Scandinavian countries. They've had a lot more of workers having a say. And I think it's not about treating workers right. It's about workers having a say in how the organization works. And
Yes.
that means autonomy. And so it is not conferred by a managerial class.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think now in our country, we seem to be mesmerized by these billionaire people who are CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or Steve Jobs even, and who have their, and a lot of people are really entranced by that kind of talent, if you would call it that. But
Yeah.
I think that it's kind of overwhelmed the thinking in this country a lot. That's the way to manage. That's the way to lead.
So I wonder if the system at large could, let's say, you taxed income over a certain amount, so that it would be an attack on the privileges of that high level of managerial class. And
I think so. Carried interest is another thing with the hedge fund people.
yeah, right.
That they don't get taxed, but ordinary, the rest of us do. They can be, all of what they earn can be seen as capital gains, therefore they earn a fortune.
Yeah.
And they are the ones out there that are joining the billionaire class, of which there are now 700.
Yeah. And I think what the right wing, if you want to call it, their system says is essentially the stance of corporate America is, listen, guy, you don't like to be told what to do, right? You ordinary American citizens, you don't want somebody taking your money and spending it on something else. You don't want people having regulations about what you can do. Well, guess what? We don't like it either. We're just like you. We want to be free to do what we want to do and not have big government tell us blah, 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 blah. So a whole ethic that doesn't take into account that the more influence and power your actions have, the more accountable you need to be that those actions are in keeping with the survival of the whole. So because the level of damage and influence you can have is enormous. So therefore there's a national interest, if only, or a human interest in
Well, I'd like to talk about two
Go ahead.
things. One is I understand that the whole system of debt is rigged to bring money to the top. Because who lends money? And where does the interest go?
Yeah.
So anybody with a credit card or a mortgage is paying it out at the top. So if you know that, then you don't get into debt. If you don't want to do that.
If you can afford to not get into
you
debt.
Don't get, right. Well, a lot of people can afford not to. I mean, like I had a little mortgage and I paid it down as quick as I could, a little at a time. And because I ran the numbers, I can run numbers, and I saw how much of the mortgage was interest. And I thought, I don't want to give it to that bank. The bank doesn't even like me. Because when I tried to pay off the mortgage, they stalled and they stalled. Finally, I went to the bank and sat down. I had to do this 3 days in a row. And I said, where's the paper? I want to sign it. I'm done. And they didn't want me to be done. So that's one thing, is debt.
Well, Carol,
And
I'm very sorry that your bank doesn't like you, and I'm proud of you for carrying that weight.
for realizing that.
Yeah, well, yeah, but also just for bearing the burden of them not liking you. I think that's wonderful. Good for you. What
Well, I
self-respect.
didn't find I did not find that they were very ethical. In fact, they got cited for fraud. This was Bank of America.
Really?
Anyway, the second thing which leads into that is just education.
Yeah.
I know things that other people don't know. Like, I knew that how that interest works, and I knew if I paid it off a little at a time, you know, I'd get out of that mortgage really quick. Even at $200 a month more, which I could put on my mortgage and not go out to eat or something like that. And then the other
Not
thing
go out to
about
eat.
education. I know. The other thing, you gotta support your community. But the other thing is, what was I gonna say? Oh, I had a job as a bookkeeper in a place in town, which, because no one else was doing it, I became the human resources person too. And I taught the workers all of their rights they did not know. And the bosses, if they wanted to get rid of someone, they would harass them until they quit. And I would tell them, if you quit, you can't get unemployment. But if you get fired, you get unemployment for no cause.
Right.
And also around the health system, I would have to call up the health insurance company and tell them what they needed to do for us, because they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to pay. So you need some education, some grit, and some advocacy in this system, or because right? And that's what the union people did. They put their lives on the line for a lot of this stuff. But if you find yourself in a place where you see what's going on, you can make a difference. I guess that's my soapbox.
So, well, I love that, but I'm just going to park that in the conversation we're having. Right? I'm saying, in every one of these spheres is a place where one can stand up for decency, or whatever you want to call it, and that each of us can find the places where we have the knowledge or the interest or the guts to make a difference. So I want to just say that. So that's you applying the talent and the smarts that allowed you to have that level of understanding and applying it away to make the world a better place. So
Look at the student loan thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
Look at the slavery
oh,
that's creating. Talk about slavery.
Well, the government is charging inordinate amounts of interest on those loans. And a lot of the loans that people are carrying for long periods of time are built up primarily because the interest keeps accruing. And Elizabeth Warren has a whole thing about that. The interest that banks have to pay for loans is ridiculously low, whereas what the student loans have to pay in a really bizarre, strange system of confusion is very high. And to get those loans down to interest that's bearable is just, it's really difficult. I wish they would just do away with the interest they're charging at least. But
my daughter and granddaughter both.
It keeps going up. It's almost $1.7 trillion now.
My daughter and granddaughter both have horrible school debt, and I've been writing you, Senator Merkley, he's forgiving. He is for forgiving school debts.
Yeah,
Carol, I did the same thing you did about paying off my mortgage. Paid it off as fast as I could. And credit cards, it's best to pay it off every month.
right. I
Yeah,
do that.
yeah. Now I'm even using cash. Right.
Let me ask a question. We've got 10 minutes left, right? Not even 9 minutes. We could just keep talking and wind this down. I could offer a little experiential meditation, and we wouldn't have time to do a lot, but I've also sort of uh, proposed how people could work with it between classes. Has anyone done anything of the going inside and trying to move from impulse?
Yeah.
You're nodding, Nina. Tell us a little something, if
I
you.
do some yoga almost every morning, and I'm
Yeah,
doing some qigong. And
yeah,
I for years meditated with Deepak Chopra,
yeah,
and I meditated with Maharishi before the Beatles met him in
yeah.
Berkeley,
So if you,
1963.
yeah, okay. Well, anyway, should I lead a little thing like that, or do we want to just wind down the conversation?
I'm up for that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Proposing.
Okay. Well, so this is, so one part, right, of the original goals of the class is that the narcissistic system tries to deny us access to our communion with other people, but also communion with our own inner resources for belonging. And it does that in part by telling us that we are by nature selfish, separate, uh, unconnected selves, and that the civilization is built against our basic nature. And so this is about just us finding our belonging and our ground in our actual belonging to nature and the world and to ourselves. So I'm just trying to promote people having easy. I know that people here have all had practices that you've developed for that, but this is just a quick and dirty way to try and do it. So I'm just going to lead a short meditation and then tell you where, depending on time, where you could take that if you work on it with yourself. Um, and the question a little bit is, if you have practices, is there something you can add from this as a starting point into the practice? Because with all of our practices, they can be, and they have an element of being routine. And there's a question of, can we heighten our ability to do them with a kind of presence, inner presence? So get comfortable. This is quick and dirty meditation. You don't have to hike or walk for hours on your knees, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be the next class. Okay. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and focus your attention to your literal experience of being a living creature in your body. And pay attention to everything that tells you beyond the shadow of a doubt and without need of confirmation from anyone else. How do you know for sure, in your experience, in the moment, that you are not a marble statue of yourself, but that you are a living, breathing organism? What energy or rhythms or pulsations or exchanges or vibrations do you feel, warmth or pain and discomfort? What do you feel that lets you know you're a living organism? And this is not some highfalutin spiritual idea. This is a literal fact of your existence on this planet and in your body. Because we are all parts of nature just as much as eagle and the hawk and the fox and the slime mold and fungi, and that we have within the mitochondria of every one of our cells, there's a campfire burning. That campfire is sourced by the rivers and streams and trickles of blood that send sustenance to every campsite and that take away what's not needed at the campsite. And it takes place in the floods and storms of hormones that pass through every pore of our body, through the intricate neuronal systems that reach every corner of our body and through which electronic messages are sent back and forth to connect the whole in a complex web. It's in the underlying rhythm of our breathing as we take in and give back to the world, in particular exchanging oxygen for CO2 for oxygen from the trees. And for every moment that we've been on this planet, the drumbeat of our heart, like a jungle in the forest, that's the background and the foundation of every moment of our lives. So sense into wherever that life force is in whatever form and shape it's in your body right now. It could be a subtle little spring in the desert or a sprout in the desert that needs your exquisite attention. If so, pour the nourishment of your attention upon it. It might be a raging storm that blows through every part of your body. Let your body get big enough to contain it and to hold it and to be vitalized. And see if you feel that energy in your body right now. Is there anything that wants to happen in terms of movement? It could be tiny, it could be subtle, it could be nothing, it could be a big movement. If you just let that energy move you so that you're being moved by the energy itself, so that you are a vehicle of that energy, so that that energy is moving you free of whatever ideas or notions or vanities or anything else you may have about your movement. Is there anything that just wants to happen that would be the extension of actually being moved by the life force into you in the transition from experiencing it in yourself to acting in the world and to experience your relationship to the life force outside of you? And then see if you can feel the reverberation, the dialogue between the energy outside of you and the energy inside of you, which is the ultimate experience of your total, ultimate, full citizenship and belonging in existence. And know that this place is here for you whenever you choose to visit it, and it will be you will visit it with increasing ease, like a favorite spot in the woods. The more you come here, and the more the path to this place gets worn, and where you can plug into your sustenance from the life force and experience yourself as an expression of that life force. When you're ready, no rush, open your eyes with a soft focus. Come on back into the room and see how much you can keep that connection to your inside with you as you look at the folks who've been on this little ride with you. So if this is useful or interesting, I recommend, I encourage you to practice it a little bit, maybe, as much as you can. And to also notice if, particularly if you have routine practices that are well developed, um, whether starting from this place can add to a kind of presence as opposed to the routinized participation. And the routines are great. Having routine practices is very important. But is there a level of presence if you start from this place that can inhabit um, whatever practices you have developed that have been important for you? Okay. Anybody else want to say something wonderful to close our session? No pressure. It's got to be really wonderful, though. All right. This is a lovely group. And great greetings from three people who couldn't make it, who both all said to pass on to you how much they've appreciated your company. Okay. I'm going to close the group now.
Is this our last?
No, we have one more group. One more official group, which is going to be spirituality and science. The relationship, I'll call it the false polarity between spirituality and science.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.